All right, so recording in progress. Today's worksheet follows up on the topic 5 workshop. We're talking about correlation and causation. And so remember, topic 5 was about step 4 of the research process, the drawing conclusions part. And the idea is that when we undertake a research study, often the conclusion we find takes the form of something is related to something else. So for example, we found in one of the first studies we looked at, the very good for you, the conclusion was that eating 3 or more serves of berries a week seems to be associated with a reduced risk of heart attack. So that study shows a relationship or a correlation between 2 variables, so between the number of serves of berries someone eats and their heart health. So when we find a relationship like that in a study, and often through a fairly detailed involved research process, you identify a correlation. That correlation then so the conclusion of the research is really a correlation. It says that eating berries is correlated with improved heart health. So what we looked at in topic 5 is ways of understanding the correlation. So thinking about a correlation, what does that mean? Once we've identified a correlation, how do we work out whether it's a positive correlation or a negative correlation? And what does that even mean? Correlations can be weak or strong. So a weak correlation is one where, or a strong correlation is one that allows us to make a fairly good prediction. So if we know the value of one variable, we can predict quite accurately the value of the other variable, whereas a weak correlation, that prediction might not be so reliable. Positive correlation is one where the 2 variables kind of increase at the same time, and a negative correlation is one where the variables work against each other. So we'll see some examples of that today and get you some practice on identifying positive and negative correlations. So there's the 4 kind of features of correlations. They're positive or negative, and they're strong or weak. And then the other thing we looked at in topic 5 is if we identify a correlation, what can we then say about why that correlation exists? And so what we looked at was whenever we have a correlation, there are actually 4 possible explanations for that correlation. And we talked about those 4 possible explanations and the importance of going through each of those explanations and working out which is the most likely or most plausible or most reasonable of those 4 explanations. And that requires some critical thinking, and it's not always obvious. It can be quite a hard question to work out what is the best explanation for the correlation. So that's something that sometimes just needs more research. It's not something that the data tells us. All right, so let's start with this first question. So question 1, so this is something I've noticed. There seems to be a correlation or a relationship between how much time someone spends playing computer games and how much time they spend studying numeracy. And the question is, so when I say firstly that there's a correlation between these 2 things, all I'm saying is there's a relationship. I've noticed that there is some kind of relationship between these 2 variables. So the 2 variables are a variable is something that varies, something that you can measure. So obviously you can measure how long someone spends playing computer games, and you can measure how much time they spend studying numeracy. So those are the 2 variables in this statement. And we're asking in this question whether the correlation is likely to be positive or negative. So remember, positive correlation is one where as one variable increases, the other one increases as well. And a negative correlation is one where if one of them increases, the other one decreases. So when you're asked to identify whether it's a positive correlation or a negative correlation, well, firstly, does everyone agree that those 2 variables are related in some way? The amount of time someone spends studying is related to the amount of time they spend playing computer games? Yeah, good. And then if they are related, or as they are related, is it a positive correlation or a negative correlation? So if someone spends a lot of time playing computer games, what happens to what can you tell me about the amount of time they might spend studying numeracy? Is it likely to be high or is it likely to be low?
Low.
Low. Okay, so if someone spends a lot of time studying playing computer games, you would expect that would leave them not very much time to study numeracy. So when you've got that kind of situation where the 2 variables work against each other, that's a negative correlation. you can say it in a different way. You can say if someone spends a lot of time studying numeracy, then there's a pretty good chance they're not going to have much time to play computer games. Okay, so it doesn't matter which variable is going up and which variable is going down, so long as they're working against each other, moving in opposite directions, one goes up, the other comes down, that's a negative correlation. And in terms of explaining why it's a negative correlation, you want to explain it in the way that we've just kind of talked about. So, you know, you'd say this correlation is positive, or sorry, is negative, because if someone spends a lot of time playing computer games, they're likely to have not so much time left for studying numeracy, or something along those kinds of lines in your own words. Any questions about that first question? Yeah, all good? Okay. All right, so fairly straightforward, just an example to kind of get us warmed up, because we're going to skip question 2 for a moment and go to question 3, because that's kind of probably the harder question on the worksheet. And not hard because it's difficult, but just hard because it's a bit more involved. Okay, so question 3 points out a correlation between two things, and it says there's a positive correlation between the crime rate in a city and the size of its homeless population. And the first part of answering this question asks you to explain what that statement means. So what I'd like you to do there is to think about, also the statement has a bit of statistical jargon in it. It says there's a positive correlation. If someone doesn't know what that means, how could you explain to them what this statement says? So how would you explain to them what it means to say there's a positive correlation between the crime rate in a city and the size of its homeless population? So that's part A. Part B, we're going to write down the 4 explanations for the correlation. So remember the 4 explanations we talked about. Whenever you've got 2 variables that are correlated, there are 4 possible explanations for that correlation. And the 4 possible explanations are those ones that I do with my hands. So this causes this, or this second thing causes the first thing, or something else causes both of those things, or it's just a coincidence. So all 4 of those explanations are always possible. Like, you always have to kind of consider each of those in turn. Sometimes one of them just goes, nah, but you look at the 4 possible explanations and you decide, yeah, that one's really not appropriate at all. That's not going to be one of my explanations. You still have to list all 4 of them and work through each of the 4 of them to consider which of those explanations are plausible or likely. And that's what you're doing in part C. So to do this question, I'm actually going to experiment with sticking you in breakout rooms, and I'll stop the recording. So I'll stop the recording now, pop you in breakout rooms, and then get you to discuss the question 3 with each other.